Hello, everyone. Welcome to Symposion's podcast, which we call Podcastion. And today we're talking with Professor Runhardt about time travel and counterfactuals. And let's see how pop culture might relate to philosophy, and mostly philosophy of science and social science.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Thank you for having me. That's really nice to be invited. Yeah. So, let's have a look. I gave you a book to read. I've got it here somewhere as well. Which
time
is
again,
not very highbrow. So don't expect great things from it philosophically or otherwise. It's called Time and Time Again, and it's by Ben Elton. It's the only book by Ben Elton that I've read, but I really enjoyed it, and I thought that we could use it as a jumping off point to talk about these issues. So,
yeah,
what did you think?
It was a wild book. The premise of the book is it's 2024, and there's a man called Hugh Stanton, and he is going to go back in time to 1914 to prevent the First World War, because people in his time are convinced that has been the greatest evil that's ever been performed, and therefore that it ought to be prevented.
Yes.
And he is going to kill the person who killed Franz Ferdinand, and he's going to kill Kaiser Wilhelm.
Yes. So he's going to kill the assassin principle, and he's going to make sure that means that there's no assassination on Franz Ferdinand. That's right.
Yes.
And then, of course, he wants to kill Kaiser Wilhelm as well.
Yes.
And the question is, was that a good idea or not?
Yeah.
It wasn't. Spoiler alert.
No. By the way, I'm Hannah.
I'm Pepijn.
Right.
Which
is lovely introduction.
Lovely introduction. And we're gonna give quite some spoilers for the book, because what happens in the book is quite essential, especially what happens in the end, I think, to the notion of time travel. And the question if time travel in the way it's performed in this book, or time travel at all, can be helpful in preventing things. Because the I think the best way to go about this might be just to jump into it.
Sure.
The question, why do they think it's going to be a good plan to kill these people? And why... And what does it turn out to be?
Yes, they think it's a good plan. It turns out to be a bad plan with lots of sort of complications in between. So the key question that anyone who's writing a good time travel story must ask themselves is, what kind of changes can you make, and how will they affect the future? And so there are different ways to do this. You have theories like the butterfly effect, where if you step on a little butterfly, in the Cretaceous time period or something like that, that means that everything goes wrong. In the future, I mean, there might not be the kind of evolution that you expect. Humans might not, make it, all of that. You also have the kind of time travel story where you can't change anything, right? Where you're always in a closed loop. And those ones, I feel, are quite realistic, in the sense that because you can't change anything, you don't run into a paradox like killing your parents.
Yeah, right.
Making that you've never been born, or you don't get into situations like in Ben Elton's book where time branches into different tracks. And so that is what Ben Elton's decided. He said to himself, by traveling back into 1914, you split the time periods that come after, right? So you've got your first iteration of that century, you've got your second iteration of the 20th century, and so on. Now, there's no contact between those time streams, except when it comes to the very first moment where time travelers can leave notes to each other. That's sort of how it works. But you don't know what happened to you in the other time iteration and all of this, and very complicated stuff. it causes some massive plot holes, probably, right? Branching out like that probably causes all kinds of messes. But that's what Ben Elton, in all his wisdom, has decided. And why has he done that? I think he wants to tell us a little bit more about how much worse it could have been.
Exactly.
And I mean, he does that in a way that is definitely very value laden, right? He has his own opinions about what's wrong with the current 21st century, and those things include anything from global warming, sensible, to overuse of mobile phones. You know,
he really focused on identity politics as well. I noticed when he travels back to 1914. In the first few days, he keeps repeating to himself, I thought this kind of group wouldn't agree with me, or if I'd done this, then the feminists and the ecologists would have thought something about this, and they would have disagreed with me, and it would have been awful.
Yes. I mean, it's not a perfect book.
No, but it's wild.
Some of the problems with it include he seems to think that one of the problems in the future is political correctness, it seems, because he occasionally says something like, PC culture, and we need to do something. It's like, whoa, global warming I get, but I don't get why you want to change it. Does this protagonist learn? No, he doesn't, because the first time he meets a feminist who might be able to shed some light on this, he sleeps with her because she's so impressed by his modern 21st century.
His performative modern mindset, by the way.
It's wonderful because he meets a woman in the train, and she's the only other person on the train, and she's a feminist, and they like each other because he's kind of woke, but not really. No. And then she tells him that she's had a relationship with a woman for a bit of time. And then he's like, well, I think same-sex relationships are fine. And she says, same-sex relationships? What's that? Yeah. And it just keeps continuing. And it's... Yeah.
And then she decides to sleep with him because that's, the sensible thing to do at that point, I guess. Right. Very strange. Very strange.
The views on women expressed in this book are interesting. They're either
problematic, yes.
yes, very problematic, because most women are described as attractive. He meets Rosa Luxemburg at one point, and he's like, well, she's quite attractive. Yeah. And then he meets another woman whose hat's been shaved and who's got a lot of tattoos, and he's like, well, if she looked a bit different, she could have been really sexy. Yeah, exactly. And then there's his professor who initiates him into the time travel thing, and he describes her as quite vile. Yeah. As he keeps describing her bum, how she stands in front of the fire, and and her mustache, and it's a very weird way of talking about women, which does not. Right? Yes.
So, as an author, you could decide to write a protagonist who is sexist in this very particular way. You could do that, but there's nothing that tells me in the book that Ben Elton doesn't have the same views as his protagonist. There's nothing in there that causes him to change his mind or to go through any kind of character development, I would say. So, and the same goes for the women, right? The women don't go through any character development. There is no character development. No. The only thing that changes is the 20th century. And even then, it seems like the 20th century in all of its iterations, its final iterations, is sort of bad, right? And it's sort of similar. So similar problems arise, and so that's an interesting thing. So yes, the book is deeply problematic. It gives you some good views, though, on I would say the way that we can think about history and what causes what in historical context. Yes. So there are other books that might do the same, right? But I like this particular way of writing about it. It's also interesting to me because it's such it's not a highbrow way of writing. anyone can pick up this book and like it. I mean, the Daily Telegraph likes it. It says the Sunday Mirror likes it. So it's not something that only your university professors will enjoy.
No,
I mean, having said that, he could have written a book that was less sexist.
Yes. Because
Obviously.
I think I often read about fiction that there's sexism it's not that sexism is not allowed in fiction or even in progressive fiction, but the difference is between a sexist world and a sexist author.
Yes.
Because the characters, you can have a sexist world where people are repressed, but you can have characters that are allowed to have a kind of development. You can have women that can be replaced by things other than a fridge or a lamp. That's also a trope or a way of thinking about women in fiction. Sometimes people think, well, can this woman be replaced by a sexy lamp? And that's often the case. But that's the world is sexist in Ben Elton's book because it's 1914, but the characters are also sexist and it's written in a sexist way.
I think the latter is the most important because the ways some characters are described outside of the context of the main character, outside of Hugh's point of view, is still very suggestive and female body oriented, in my opinion.
Definitely.
It was difficult to read at some points.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, to describe that, so at one point we're introduced to a different iteration of time in which communism has reigned supreme and in such a way that it has destroyed the world. And how is this made personal and how is the human interest introduced? By talking about a particular woman who has had to kill her babies.
Yes, and who's been raped multiple times.
And that, of course, right, that sort of focuses you on this woman otherwise would have been a good mum. But now, look at communism. Look at what communism has done to her. She has had to kill her babies. Yeah. Ooh, interesting. Hot take on communism and on women. And it's not good. It's not good in any way.
Because,
Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, I thought we'd explain a bit more about the different iterations of time.
Yeah.
I think it's important to just talk about the way time travel works in this book because it's quite specific. Yeah,
it's also Isaac Newton fan fiction, I think.
It is.
Because the book, the author's note at the beginning states that at one point Newton just stopped really doing anything.
Yeah, went crazy
at one point in his life, and the explanation given for that in this book is that he just developed a theory on the relativity of time and time travel.
Yeah.
And he talks that since he says that gravity has an influence on time and that therefore there are time loops.
Yes.
And there's one of these time loops is like somewhere
in a basement in Istanbul.
In a basement in Istanbul in 2025, and it goes back to 1914.
Exactly, yeah. So it's sort of your bad version of wormholes. There's no scientific basis for any of this, right? So this is completely,
not at all,
completely made up. Yeah,
it tries to be hard science fiction, but it isn't.
No, definitely isn't.
No.
And yes, it is. The idea would be that Newton discovered what Einstein did well in advance and realized what this would mean for time travel. And he did some calculations which gave him space-time coordinates, which then, fortunately, we're in a basement in Istanbul and not somewhere in the middle of the sun or whatever.
Yeah. They discussed that at one point.
And that's clever, right? I mean, it does tell you that it's a little bit more convenient than you would expect.
Yeah.
But fine. If there had been many time loops, right, that would have maybe solved that issue, right? So if there's so many different time loops and you just need to be in the right place. But then why don't people try and travel more often? And before you know it.
Yeah. No.
One of the things that I find interesting in the way that they describe it, so I've only highlighted one bit, not literally, right, is the idea that you loop, but you keep on going through that loop. somehow this loop is never broken. People keep restarting the 20th century, or 1914. They keep restarting most of the 20th century, and they can't break out of this until they find a way to destroy Newton's results and tell everyone, or avoid telling everyone what they can do. Yes. Because apparently humans are so arrogant that they think that by just thinking through the developments in 1914 leading up to 1914, they can make a change which will make their world better. So no one in any iteration leaves well enough alone, right? So they all decide to go back in time and restart the universe. And this has disastrous results, right? Sometimes there's communism, right? Because apparently Ben Elton does not like communism.
No,
sometimes... Sorry?
Yeah, it's awful. No, it's awful. I also wrote down at one point that it's all a plan to shut down the Marxists.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And I mean, he is so focused on telling us what's wrong with our iteration of the 20th century, it seems, right? That he forgets that he is himself, I think, probably... falling into the trap that all of his characters are, right? But he thinks he knows what's wrong.
Yes, because what happens, what is revealed at the end is that the time loop our main character Hugh Stanton is participating in is not a time loop when he's gone back from our timeline, but actually from a timeline where there's only been the First World War, and it lasted from 1914 to 1926. There's never been a Second World War, and this means that, at least that's my interpretation, that is the umpteenth time loop, and that our time is a different one, because there's no Hitler. There's no Hitler of at least imports in this one. So, and then they find out at the end there's been, I think they find 12 envelopes of previous time travelers.
Yeah, exactly. So and of course, that means that there's at least 12 other iterations of the time travel loop. But there might be more, because not everyone leaves an envelope, right? Not everyone's clever enough to leave an envelope. Some people might be killed just after they've done the thing that they came back to do. It's interesting that he somehow puts our time loop at a different point, right? So this book was written in 2014. And I realized that very soon it'll be a bit strange to read it, because you might think, oh, well, we're after 2024 now, so it's fine, right? We're out of the looping that keeps on spinning. I think he says at some point he compares it to a spinning wheel, right? The spinning wheel keeps spinning. You can't get out. Oh, no, right? We keep going through these horrible events. There's also an interesting thing there where Hugh Stanton, it seems, wants to stop the time loops because he feels that he is, or the 21st century people who do the time travel are responsible not just for the horrible things that happen in their iteration, but for all of the other ones too. So that is a lot of responsibility. It's very difficult to do the calculations on that responsibility, right? And asking yourself not just what do we owe to future generations, like you might do in ethics, but also what do we owe to other iterations of our descendants or our ancestors. Oh my gosh. And it gets very messy very quickly.
I thought in the end of the book, you got shot by one of the other iterations of the time travelers.
While he's trying to kill Rosa Luxemburg.
Yes.
Yeah, no, while he's trying to go... Yeah, first Rosa Luxemburg and then go to the Newton's box and destroy that.
Yeah.
Which kind of confuses me a little bit,
mm-hmm.
because that means that when you went back to 1914... he was already in the loop in which he would be killed later. But there is probably also a loop where Rosa died, not you, the other Rosa.
Right.
And he destroyed the box, or at least apparently not, because otherwise people wouldn't be able to go back. This is one of the plot holes that basically confuses me a little bit.
Sure, it's a plot hole, right? And I'm going to accept that there are plenty of plot holes. The only way out of that plot hole, I think, would be if somehow you has got this obsession for a person he's met on a train, like we said, who's a feminist and who decides to sleep with him. And she is the best thing that's happened to him since his wife died. He's only talked to her a couple of times and they've had a lot of sex. That's basically what's going on, right? And so he's obsessed with her. But she finds out that he thinks he's a time traveler. So she obviously thinks he's crazy, doesn't want anything to do with him, reports him to the police for killing the Kaiser. Spoilers all, right? And he decides, no, the only thing I can do to convince her that this is actually the case is show her Newton's box. So perhaps he will never destroy Newton's box until he's shown her Newton's box. So there are ways that you can get out of this. Perhaps she is profoundly uninterested in going with him to see this box.
I think she is. In
all the time loops, I would be too, right? I would be.
But
too.
I think the whole problem with the characterization of this woman is that she's at first portrayed as a feminist who's into women's rights, which is wonderful for her, especially in those times. And then Hugh kills the Kaiser Wilhelm. Then there's at least the start of a civil war in Germany.
Yes.
And then he gets shot. He gets into the hospital because he's shot in the stomach and people think he's going to die. And then she shows up at his bedside and he tells her to get the antibiotics he brought from the future.
Yeah.
And then he asks her, but your feminist pursuits, where are they? And then she's like, oh, it's a war. I can't be a feminist in a war.
Well, so what I think what Ben Elton is trying to do there is show that if we are in an iteration in which there is such a radical repression of socialists, because that's what's going on in that loop, right? Because Kaiser Wilhelm is killed and the murder is blamed on the socialists by you, by the way. Great plan. There is so much repression going on of socialists in general, not just in Germany. Apparently this spirals out of control in other European countries as well, including Ireland, where she lives. That there is not even a question of doing anything for women's rights anymore, because the world is such a mess. Why would we even try to get the vote? That's the deal. Interesting. I mean, you can probably say a lot about intersectionality there, and she's not just a feminist, she's also a socialist, so perhaps, but that's never made clear, and he doesn't really spend any time on it. Still, it's an interesting read. I feel like it says a lot about how you could think about causes in history. And in fact, virtual history, as it's sometimes called, or alternative history, that's a popular thing to do. Unfortunately, it's mainly popular in pop culture. And it's not taken that seriously by many, say, political scientists, historians, international relations scholars at all. So that makes it a bit tricky, because to say something about the causes in history, you do need to say something about, in my opinion at least, what would have happened if certain things had not occurred. Now, in order to do that analysis, you quickly get into some really speculative alternative history, as in Ben Elton, or you get into some really technical, difficult semantics. And that's something that I think is interesting about this, right? So we need to think about what kinds of lessons can we draw maybe from this very bad book about what you can do in historical analysis, in historical causal analysis. Ben Elton's opinion, it seems, is you can't do any of that. You don't know what's going to happen. There's no way of predicting any counterfactual truth, right? So counterfactual in this case would be what would have happened if Franz Ferdinand had not been killed. And he says, even though they thought that this is what would happen, in fact, they couldn't predict the truth value of this counterfactual. Interesting. I think that says a lot about, why some bits of this book are philosophically interesting as well. Because counterfactuals are a philosopher's, domain, I would say.
Yes, that's the intersection we find between this book and philosophy, right?
Well, for me, and I'm sure you can do a lot of sort of feminist philosophy on this book too, philosophy of literature. Yes. I'm sure. The way I think about it is from a philosophy of social science perspective. One of the big questions, like I said, is, how do you do causal analysis in things like political science, sociology, etc.? Because in political science, at least, a lot of the causal analyses that you are doing are single event analyses. So, had this or that event not occurred, what would have happened then? Mm-hmm. The way that people usually think about causation, there are pretty much two directions you can go in as a social scientist. Either you think that you can somehow observe causal relations without doing any, let's say, alternative histories or things like that. And the other way that you can think about this is we need to somehow look at difference making. So has there been a difference as a result of this particular event? And you can do that by using statistics, which is difficult because you usually need to then make some strange comparisons between countries, say. In the case of the First World War, what are your comparisons? How are you going to do that statistics? Very difficult to get a large enough N to do that. And the alternative would be to do some kind of counterfactual analysis, right? Had this not occurred, what would have happened then? How can we find out about that? My opinion is that you can find things out about the truth value of counterfactuals. You can't be sure about them, right? I wouldn't risk time travel on them, but you can make some kind of predictions with some degree of certainty. And that is against Ben Elton's view, I think, because Ben Elton says there's no way you can predict what's going to happen.
I think Ben Elton, he spells it out quite clearly in, he talks about the difference between historical dialectical material Marxism. He creates a dichotomy between that and between the romanticists, as he calls them, who believe that it's people who make history and not the material conditions. Yeah. And he really is quite angry at the Marxists. Yeah. But I think it's really interesting that the way it plays out in the book, at least, is a reason that history is so unpredictable for, at least for Elton, the timelines Elton creates, is because a lot of things are not taken into consideration. A lot of things are not thought through. Yeah. I think that also plays a big part in his conviction why why history is unpredictable in such a way. Yes. Because he talks about I think once the main character has killed the person who ought to have killed Franz Ferdinand, he thinks it through and it's like, well, if the war doesn't happen, then the feminist the women's rights revolution won't happen, and if that won't happen, and then he also talks, when he has killed Kaiser Wilhelm, he talks about how the Jews are being blamed for everything, and that's all these professors at Cambridge have not taken the anti-Semitism that's so prevalent in their society and history still, has not been taken into account, and that I think that also plays a big role in. They are so focused on the if we prevent Franz Ferdinand from being killed, and if we then kill Kaiser Wilhelm to still prevent a war and create a civil war in Germany, then everything will be fine.
Exactly. There won't be any global warming.
No.
Which is sort of interesting. The way that we can think about that, and the way that you can think about it in sort of philosophy of causation, is that these are very complex networks of causes and effects. And so anti-Semitism might be a factor there. What these Cambridge professors who sent Hugh Stanton back in time assume is that by only killing Kaiser Wilhelm and keeping everything else fixed, right, this would be the result. Now, the problem is that by sending Hugh Stanton back in time, he doesn't keep everything fixed, right? Because the fact that he kills Kaiser Wilhelm has lots of other effects, which in turn influence outcomes that they are eventually interested in. And they don't see those causal links. Now, of course, we could say something like, well, surely you should have taken this into account, the anti-Semitism, etc., etc. But it's very difficult, and that is a problem for causation in the social sciences in general, to think of all the factors that might be important, that might have some effect. That's why some people say that we need to do statistics, because then at least we can sort of do randomized controlled trials on history. I mean, that's hard. It's making lots of assumptions still that are problematic in my perspective, at least. And the whole other way that we could go about this is to say, listen, it's just too hard. We don't do causation in social science. Let's just ignore it altogether. Let's just say, we don't know what caused the First World War. We do know how to describe it in enough detail, and we can perhaps come to some understanding about what people who were in that situation felt, what their motivations were, what the meanings were behind their actions, like what the meanings were behind, Kaiser Wilhelm's decision to go to war in the first place, what kind of symbolism is involved in that. You can get into some really interesting analyses, but there won't be any causal stuff.
No.
In my perspective, it's impossible to get causation out of the picture. All right, it's impossible to. You can use weasel words and say, well, this influenced that, but influencing is just causation. You can say things like, well, this might have had an impact on, but that's just causation. So you need to do something. And the way to go about it, I would say, is to do counterfactual analysis. But I know that others disagree with me, right? And I have debates with others about this regularly. That's sort of my area of research. The thing about this text is, I think, that it makes clear how complex the network of causes is. Right? Even though Ben Elton decides to focus a lot on certain causes and not others. A lot of time on communism, but not fascism. He spends a lot of time on feminism, in very flawed ways, but he spends a lot of time on feminism, but not on, let's say, race, right? There's nothing in there about that. So
there's one character I think of Indian descent.
Yes,
and he's not painted in a very good pic. He's not portrayed very positively.
No, he's not. No, he is the Cambridge mathematician who decides to check Newton's math. Yeah.
And he's a pop culture professor, and people look down on him because he's a pop culture professor.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's that, of course, is difficult because it's written from Hugh Stanton's point of view. I think all of those descriptions, and Hugh Stanton is probably a sexist, racist, flawed sort of James Bond knockoff. But interestingly, I would say there is a lot of philosophical work being done about sort of counterfactual analyses like these. So the text that I made you read for my sins is, and for your sins, is the Lewis text on counterfactuals.
Yes.
What did you think of that text? Because I'm really curious to know, did you get anything out of it?
I think there was a lot of just words that I couldn't really place. It took me a bit of time to get used to the language. Yeah. And once I got used to the language, I think it was quite understandable.
Yeah, right. I thought at the start, oh my God, what am I getting myself into?
Yes.
Especially the second analysis example uses, because I just thought it was a very convoluted way to say something very simple, or I really don't understand what he is saying. That was basically my thoughts the entire time. Either okay, but you're just saying that the past is in a sense independent from the present, in a sense that the present, if you change something in the present, it doesn't really, or it shouldn't affect the past. But then say that in a very technical and convoluted way to make it able to have some philosophical inquiry about it. He
talks about the asymmetry of counterfactuals, that the present, that the counterfactuals of the present to the past, they do things, and from the present to the future that works, but from the present to the past does not work. The what if I do something else now, then works, but then in the future it will, but if I do something now, then in the past it doesn't work.
It's the asymmetry of time, right? You can't change the direction of time, so you can affect the future but not the past by acting differently now. And the reason why Lewis is such an influential author is because he provides a framework for thinking about counterfactuals, and this is still very popular. But everyone agrees, I think, that it's also very technical and it's very difficult to get into. This is sort of the easiest version of this argument. Believe it or not, he can use a lot of logical tools to make it even harder. What is interesting about this text, I think, for those of you listening who want to read it too, is to think about the Nixon example, because that's, I think, the most simple thing to get into. What Lewis is trying to do, like I said, he's trying to give some analysis of when counterfactuals are true and when they're false. How can we evaluate counterfactuals, right? How can we evaluate statements like, if this had happened, then this would occur. Right? So he is trying to figure out what we can say about the effect of Nixon pressing the button, right? The red button that is supposed to be connected to the nuclear arsenal in the United States, what the effect would be of that. And he's trying to evaluate a very simple counterfactual. If Nixon had pressed the button, then nuclear holocaust would have occurred, or something like that. And in order to do so, he starts thinking about most similar worlds to our world, because ours is a world in which Nixon did not press the button. That's all we know about it, right? And we know that there has not been any nuclear war between the United States and its enemies. So we know at least that in our world, it's not true that Nixon pressed the button and that he caused this. So he's asking himself, what are the most similar worlds to ours in which Nixon did press the button? And that's going to be an important question for him. And he goes through different iterations, right, of that world. He thinks to himself, what kind of changes can I make? And what kind of changes can't I make? And it seems like he wants a little miracle to occur for the world to be as similar to ours as he can. And why does he want the world to be so similar? Because he thinks we can only say things about the truth value of counterfactuals. We can only make them true or false depending on how similar worlds behave. So he goes through different iterations. He says, well, maybe we should have a world in which a couple of extra neurons fired in Nixon's brain, right? That's as simple as we can do this. Makes him just sort of press the button and not anything else. Is that the most similar world? Yes, probably. There are other worlds that might be similar, and he starts thinking about how you can compare worlds and things like this. So that is relevant, I would say, to understanding historical processes, because you are asking yourself, what kinds of counterfactuals can we actually talk about? What kinds of counterfactuals are useful? And the Lewis text does that very well. The Ben Elton text, obviously not, but it's interesting to compare the two and think about the philosophical impact of this.
Yeah, because I think Elton and Lewis have a very different view of history and what precedes something, because at least that's the way I interpreted it, because Lewis talks about that, he talks about it in quite a deterministic way that he gets from the Montagne, and which I have not read about a lot, but what I gathered from it was that the way I act in this moment has been determined by everything that has happened before me. Yeah. And that's why I act this way in this moment. And only if there is something else happening now, I would have acted differently. Yeah. So if there's a miracle, if there's a little miracle, which interrupts the flow of causality or something, then something else will happen. Yeah. Exactly. Well, I think the view promoted in Elton's book is that the things that happen in history are determined on the people, and people act in chaotic ways.
Yes, exactly.
And even though Hugh Stanton, our main character, is something of a big miracle, it might... I don't know, could it be sad, do you think, that Hugh Stanton is the big miracle, and without Hugh Stanton, history would have gone this way every time? Is that what Elton might be arguing? Or is he arguing that Stanton's influence isn't really irrelevant, but that even without him, it could have been different?
I think, speaking from the perspective of the book, there have been other iterations before Hugh Stanton, so it's not Hugh Stanton that triggers this whole looping effect. It's probably the first time traveler, or Newton, right? And that's why he decides to kill off Newton at the end of the book as well, to make sure. Yeah,
that's funny. So weird. At the end of the book, he's like, Newton had just given the papers to a professor at Cambridge to show them the time, the time space-time coordinates, and then that night he goes to sleep and he's like, well, actually, maybe I shouldn't give people the power to be gods. Yeah. I'll retrieve them tomorrow, and then he goes to sleep and then he dies.
Exactly. It's very interesting. So the last section, like I said, what he says is, Newton saw space and time in the spinning wheel. He saw it spinning round and round, but never progressing, in constant motion, but also stationary, never moving beyond its fixed course. Was he right to have arranged to pass on the benefits of his insight? Was it always better to know? That had been the guiding principle of his life. Better to know, to shed light on the mysteries of the universe. But this time, to offer men yet unborn the chance to cheat fate, to shape a different destiny to the one God had created for them. And then he's like, I've made a mistake. Time was not the spinning wheel. Time was the threaded maid. That sounds much more deep than it actually is, I think. And then he dies, obviously.
Yeah. So. Yeah, that happens.
It's convenient, but I think by putting himself in the perspective of Newton in the book, I think Ben Elton tries to tell us something about what ultimately goes wrong in this time travel story, which is that you're in an infinite loop in which things keep changing, but no one actually gets any better.
And I think there's also maybe a difference between knowing and doing, because there might be a difference between Newton talks about shedding light on things and enlightening people thereby in a way, but that's different. Knowing that you could have changed history, or that history is changeable, doesn't mean that you have to do it. Therefore, you still have to travel back in time in your time loop.
Yes. And it's not Newton who's done it, right? Newton's not responsible for all of those deaths due to rampant communism. Something like that. Anyway.
I think it's really because it's quite the communist thing is just weird in this book.
Weird. Yeah, it's weird.
Because on one hand you have the socialists who are both portrayed quite positively, but also portrayed as the people who are, being killed every time. Yeah. And then they're portrayed as the people who, in the end, cause a supranational, just a worldwide phenomenon of communism.
Yes. It's an interesting way to talk, I think, about the problems with totalitarianism. I think that's the problem, right? So people take an idea and run with it and make the world into a totalitarian system and blah, blah, blah. It's not the problem of communism per se. And this is trying to defend maybe the most positive reading of Elton in this book, but that's what's going on there. There are other books that do time travel better. I would suggest that everyone reads H.G. Wells' The Time Machine because it's great. And it also has something to say about, let's say, the social order and how our society is, I would say, how our society is divided into class. And H.G. Wells, even though he wrote this about a century before Ben Elton, seems to be more open-minded about certain things than Ben Elton is, but fine. That's a good one. It's short as well. So
yeah, I think the thing I've read quite few time travel books, but I have watched a lot of Doctor Who. But one of the time travel books I have read is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which has a bit of time travel. They go to the restaurant at the end of the universe, and the thing with that book is it's very loose time travel. There's no rules because it's satire and people just go about their ways.
Exactly,
but it's also a lot of fun.
Yes, it is. Yeah. It's a great example.
Yeah.
Doctor Who is also a great example. There are some really good plot lines in there, season arcs and things that tell us more about time travel. In Doctor Who, it seems like you can change the future by altering the past. He doesn't do, closed loops that often. Another way that you can think about time travel, some Star Trek episodes are very good at time travel. Some of them are very poor at it, but some of them are very good. I'm going to look up the name of my favorite one, so maybe you can split that into the stuff.
I remember in Doctor Who once, there was an episode on Shakespeare, and I remember the Doctor inspiring Shakespeare to create a line.
Yeah.
That's also an interesting way of time travel. Like, the way this time travel works is it had already happened in our present.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the way that we think about some of these time travel loops is that you can't change anything, right? So you will have always gone back in time to inspire Shakespeare, which eventually led to you going back in time to meet Shakespeare to inspire him or not, right? And that's really an interesting way to go about this. I think what I would suggest, if you haven't watched any of the science fiction stuff and you think, no, this is not for me, I don't like this. I do like the idea of thinking about counterfactuals. There are probably some people who think that. I would suggest trying a few. Time and time again might be something for history buffs who have no problem with sexism. If you're more into, good time travel stories that aren't so deeply problematic, maybe your Doctor Who or your Star Trek is a better idea. Or just some of the great films about time travel or books about time travel, like The Time Traveler's Wife. I really like that. On Netflix, you have a lot of time travel stuff that might be interesting to people. About Time is a really good one. About Time is more of a drama.
That's a wonderful film. I really like it.
Yeah,
it's a guy who can just he can just go back in time to redo things. So I remember he meets a girl and then he just re-meets her several times because he's not sure if he's done it right.
Yeah.
But they've also got quite a few rules, I remember, in that film, because there are certain essential events you cannot go past back in time.
Yeah.
And that's what I also remember about Doctor Who. There's several things that are fixed points in time, things that ought to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that also really, in a way, seems fun, because in a way you have I can change everything, I can go back which I've already done, but there's also this also happen. You can't change anything about it.
Yeah.
Which gives a bit of suspense.
Exactly. That's true. I mean, the modern Doctor Who, definitely worth checking out for that. The way that I would start with maybe the time travel in Star Trek, I'm going to say something highly controversial, is to start with a Voyager episode called The Year of Hell, which is doing the same as Ben Elton is, but with an alternative, let's say, world. So that's nice. I would check that out. The Time Traveler's Wife, if you're more romantically inclined, I would say. How deeply philosophical can that get? There are some things about these stories that are philosophical, but most of them are just good fun. When you read something like Lewis's view on counterfactuals, that's where it gets philosophically interesting. And it still has some impact, I would say, on historical analysis, on thinking about cause and effect in social settings. Of course, fiction explores that in a very different way.
Yeah. I once remember Ursula Le Guin. I have one book by her, and in the introduction by David Mitchell, I think, it said that Ursula Le Guin always describes science fiction as thought experiments.
Yes.
As a way to... It's in a way, it's a what if, it's a counterfactual. I remember, but also just in a... If this had been different, so not necessarily time, but if one fact had been different, what would have then happened? And that's also a good part about science fiction.
Yes.
Though not about time, but about other things. Because I remember the book The Left Hand of Darkness is about a society where people, like I think 3/4 of the month they're genderless, sexless, and then 1 week of the month they're either male or female. And they have just one time off to reproduce. And she just thinks about the society in such a way, and people can be both a man and a woman, so they can be both a father and a mother. So what result does it have on the binary people think about, on parental relations? There's no Oedipus complex in that world.
Yeah, definitely.
I remember, so that's also a way science fiction, even though it's not about time, but it's also about counterfactuals.
The best way to do... Sorry, Pepijn, go ahead.
Yeah, in a sense, I mean, almost any fiction is in a sense a counterfactual because it is fiction. It is not talking about the way the world is behaving right now. The only thing is whether in such a context, when talking about philosophical relevance, is whether the context of said fiction or book is applicable to the context right now, and if it's even productive or helpful.
Yeah,
definitely.
But any fiction is a counterfactual because it's fiction.
Yeah, I think the best science fiction is science fiction that tells us something about our own society by changing something. So, for instance, like I said, The Time Machine, H.G. Wells tells us something about class in that early 20th century world. He asks important questions about, I think, our responsibilities towards nature in things like The Island of Dr. Moreau. He is very good at exploring our society through the lens of science fiction. There are also science fiction stories that don't do that at all, where you are just doing technobabble and all you're interested in is fast spaceships and the worst Star Trek is like that. I mean, it is something that people are drawn to. It's not my thing. I'm less of the big spaceships and more sort of criticism of our current society.
I think fantasy can also do this really well. I really like Terry Pratchett's Discworld books, which talk about fantasy racism in a way.
They do.
It's there's often in Pratchett there's no difference in skin color, but it's whether you're a dwarf or a troll or a human or a vampire, and that's it shifts the problem for what we encounter in our society to fantasy races where in a way, it focuses on this in such a way that you see how odd it is that we think about people in such a way, that we think the differences matter so much, because we can see that dwarves and trolls have their own strengths and they shouldn't be treated this way, but they are.
I mean,
that's what it does for me.
Yeah, race in Terry Pratchett is a bit problematic because it makes it into different sort of fixed categories, and there's nothing there about identification as. So that's a bit problematic. But yes, I mean, in general, Terry Pratchett's Discworld does say a lot about our society, whether it's international relations in like a book like Jingo, or whether it is women's rights, perhaps in all of the books about the witches.
And Monsters Regiment, maybe.
Sorry?
Monsters Regiment, it's...
Yeah. Definitely, yeah.
Cross-dressing in
Monsters Regiment is, yes. We're not going to do more spoilers. We've already done enough, I think. But that definitely says something about women's rights. I think he's more convincing on that issue than he is on racial issues.
Yes.
But nevertheless, I think he is another example of using fiction to shed light on our society. And he does so in a really engaging, a really fun way. Definitely a good thing to get into. And of course, I mean, larger, let's say, fantasy stories or more high fantasy stories also do that. It's not all about, the special quest for the one ring or whatever. It's more about, what kinds of relations are there between our societies. And again, it's Tolkien does things like that well, but you need to get through a lot of his sort of high fantasy. If you are, persistent, I think that can be very rewarding. There are other books that I prefer, but that's more of a personal, I think. Personal notes.
But I think that this just starts and talking about fantasy and science fiction in general. I'm very sorry, everyone, but the recent Hugo nominations have come out, and the books that have been nominated for the Hugo Awards, which is the biggest award in fantasy and science fiction, I think, as all nominations I know, are either written by women or talk about racism and sexism. So it's really become a big topic in well-regarded science fiction and modern fantasy.
Yes, fortunately.
So it's being seen more as something that fantasy and science fiction can be used for, more than only talking about dragons.
Right. Black Mirror, not necessarily a fantasy, but is a very good example of a series that is both somehow semi-politically involved, also with an eye on technological developments and the possible very, very bad consequences it can have, almost dystopian consequences in some contexts. Whilst at the same time keeping it realistic by placing it in a possible world that is kind of similar to ours, in the sense that there are humans and no dwarves or elves.
True. So what you're trying to do as an author is you're trying to make something that people can identify with. And personally, when I read old science fiction, it's hard to find a character to identify myself with, because they are all, a certain type of man. And the same goes for your Tolkien. There's no one in there. There are women in there, but they don't do anything or have any kind of... But then when you come to books like Outlander, for instance, which is great, I love it. The time travel in it is not maybe as advanced as it is in Ben Elton, but it's certainly more female oriented and positive.
I think, but fantasy and science fiction just has a history of ill-written female characters.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as does society as a whole. That's just how it goes.
That's very true.
But Ben Elton. So Ben Elton's book won't convince you to become a feminist, unfortunately. It will tell you, however, that somehow if you were to find a loop in time, please don't go back and change anything, because we don't know what's going to happen. There's no way that we can predict that with any kind of certainty. So that's the good lesson to take away from this. If you ever were to find yourself in a position to do time travel, please don't. Don't. Because it's going to be hard.
No. Because my idea was to end this episode with the question of, if you could go back to 1914, or maybe anywhere in time, what would you do? I think it was your question you asked me on the way here. And my answer was, I try to stop the meteorite from killing the dinosaurs. Isn't possible.
No.
But
you can try. You can try.
Then you get a very different society, right? And Doctor Who explores these questions, and they get your lizard women and all of this.
Dinosaurs on a spaceship.
Yeah, exactly. But they're on a spaceship, so at least they don't influence the way that human society develop. I find it hard to believe that we would end up in this kind of Flintstone situation where everyone is peacefully coexisting with the dinosaurs. I don't think that human society stands much of a chance then. But if that's your aim, right, fine. You would erase yourself from time. So this is not something that you could do, because it leads to a paradox, because then you can't go back in time to save the dinosaurs. Unless, of course, you set a different time loop in motion, like Dan Elton seems to believe that you do. What about you, Pepijn? Where would you go? What would you do?
I would probably be more egoistic and not go back at all. I'm a gay, I mean, I'm white at least, and I am male presenting, but I'm still very gay. And most pastimes aren't really that positive for me.
No.
That's
maybe the dinosaurs would like you.
Being able to time travel is something you need to be quite privileged to be able to have fun doing time travel. If you're a woman, if you're black, if you're any other marginalized
But listen, why would we have to travel back to Western Europe? There's no reason to do that.
That's very true. That's
ridiculous.
Very true.
I mean, there are plenty of places to go as a woman or as a black man, for that matter, where you could have an impact without being automatically, whatever, discriminated against in whatever many ways that are possible. I would say... Would you
change anything?
Would I go back and change something?
Yeah. So any
I like the idea of time travel as tourism. And that is something that you do. Yeah, you get in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because you open a restaurant at the end of time, right?
It's a wonderful restaurant.
If I knew that nothing would change by traveling back in time, I would do it. And I would go somewhere where I could, I don't know, observe some of the events that are positive in history, right? There are some really interesting sort of developments in the history of science that I would love to see. I would love to talk to people from, say the Copernican revolution. That would be hilarious to go back and talk to people then and find out more about that. I mean, I would have to dress up as a man, and again, that wouldn't be a very positive experience for me generally, but why not? The idea of time travel as a fun way to learn more about the past, that's great, that's fine. I'm not so convinced that any other way of time travel would be good for me.
Because that's the thing with Hugh Stanton, of course, which is something we haven't talked about, but he is the person chosen to go back in time because he has a military background, he knows how to survive, and he has no family, no friends.
No.
Because his wife and children have been killed.
Yeah.
Which...
No, they died.
No. He knows they've been killed. He knows they've been killed by 4 guys. But then it turns out that the professors who wanted him to go back in time had his family killed.
It was a plot all along.
Yeah.
Which was a wild thing to happen. Yeah. And so I think that's the reason why Elton is of course the ideal candidate, and why most of us aren't, because most people have connections that are important to them in such a way that they can't do this.
But listen, even if you had no connections to anyone or cared nothing about those connections, still going back in time in the way that Elton describes would lead to such radical changes in society as a whole that you'd better not do it.
That's irresponsible.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You don't know what's going to happen. That's the thing.
Yeah.
You can also just see it as like, let's just try again and see what happens.
Yeah. Exactly.
In the sense that there isn't really... It was obvious that you and his quote-unquote teachers didn't really think about what the effects would be of his intervention, but...
well,
there's also
about
no
it,
certainty that it went bad.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
I describe this book as a book about smart people written by someone who isn't as smart as them.
Oh, that's terrible. That's a terrible thing to say. Poor Ben Elton. I don't know anything about him. He might be as intelligent as that Cambridge Master of Trinity.
I hope so. I hope that he dumped himself down for it.
Here's the thing, right? If you are a serious academic, it's very hard to get time to write fun books like this. Some people do it, right? So the person who wrote Outlander, for instance, has a PhD in chemistry. And has, I think in chemistry anyway, Diana Gabaldon has a huge research background, which is why she was able to write those books and get all of her, research rights. It's an exception. If I were to try to write a science fiction story, I think I would have to give up on all of my academic work, or at least that's what I tell myself. But yeah, it's. I think for me, the question is more: if you were to write a science fiction story, what would you do? Than it is if you were able to travel back in time, what would you do? Because I'd have to think about it a long time.
Yeah, I think if I were to write a science fiction story, what would I do?
Yeah.
I often have trouble with the distinction between fantasy and science fiction.
It's fine. It's not a dichotomy, I'd say.
No, I think it's
vague. It's blurry.
It's blurry.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'd write about dragons, but science dragons.
Is that steampunk then?
I think
so. Steampunk dragons. Okay, that's fine. Yeah,
dragons.
Cool. And what issue in society would you try to shed light on with that?
Animal rights.
I'm
not very. I'm not very into animal rights consciously, but I think that dragons would really help with animal rights.
Or dragons' rights, anyway.
Yeah, at least that.
No, steampunk dragons. It's unclear if they are animals in this context.
They have a consciousness, so I think it would really help with things like, can machines have a consciousness? Because if we have steampunk dragons,
well,
in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the dolphins and the mice are more intelligent than people. Yeah. So why can't?
But he doesn't do anything sort of deep on philosophy of consciousness, right? Or philosophy of mind. But you could write a philosophy of mind story which uses dragons. Sure, I'm open-minded. I don't mind thinking about that. What about you, Pepijn?
Thanks.
Right.
I don't know automatically. I think I would like to fantasize to write a book about just the most eco-feminist, anarchist, like the most radical world possible in that context, just so I can stipulate my perfect world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I would love that as like a part of escapism. And I think it is interesting to think about, like, what are my wildest dreams in such a context, and how would that look? And is that even like possible? And are there any other issues that would arise? Because in thinking about it, I would probably realize that, oh, well, this won't happen. This will get fucked up, etc., etc., etc.
Thought experiment. Ursula Le Guin was right.
Yeah, and Ursula Le Guin, of course, does that. She does try to shed light on women's issues by removing, I think, sex rather than gender from the equation in that book that you described, which is the one Ursula Le Guin book that I've also coincidentally read. If I were to write a science fiction story, it would do something with time travel as tourism, but I think I'd like to have some kind of agency in there that does control time travel, which makes things go wrong, right? Basically.
Yeah.
Let's put time travel in a capitalist system.
What would happen if that were? I would say, you can say a lot about our institutions doing that, and how we try to control what can't be controlled. So I don't have time for that, because right now what I'm writing on are counterfactuals in political science, and that is exactly what you're doing in Bell Nelson, what you're doing by reading David Lewis, etc. So if people are interested, check out some of my work on that. I would say it's not fiction, it's not as fun as fiction, but it is definitely something that's philosophically more deep than Ben Elton.
Yes, which almost everything is.
Yes,
I'd argue.
Almost everything. Almost everything. Poor Ben Elton. I hope he doesn't listen to this podcast. If he does, then maybe we should invite him back.
We'll not name him in the description and not link my Instagram page and details.
Oh, well, you can do that and then invite him back, right? That's...
Yeah.
Right, let's have a discussion about this book with Ben Elton.
Why not? That sounds fantastic. And I'm sure that he would be interested. If you say that you're a Department of Philosophy, and you have a philosophy professor who wants to talk about it. Yeah.
I think we should. And I think that might be the end of the podcast today.
Yes.
We talked about a lot of things. We went from time travel to fantasy and science fiction to what would you do to what would you write?
Yeah.
To steampunk dragons.
Steampunk dragons,
apparently,
preferably.
yes.
Thank you very much. And but I think we also managed to discuss the philosophical aspects of it, though not as many of the counterfactual philosophical things as I'd expected, but we also talked a lot about feminism, which is also fun.
I have definitely got many different interests, and counterfactual is only one of them. I would say, philosophically speaking, there is a lot more to say about David Lewis, so definitely check out his work if you're interested. There's a really good webpage from Cambridge University about doing self-study on this issue. So I can send you that link so you can link that to your listeners.
Yeah, we'll link it in the description then, and then that's fine. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. I really enjoyed myself.
Me too.
Yeah, so did I. Perfect.
Thank you. So
who's your next guest? Who are you having after me?
I think we'll be having Jinjing Lee.
Oh, so fun.
If she's available at the end of May, which is a busy time. Yeah. So we'll see.
Well, I mean, I'm always happy to talk more about your steampunk dragons if that's important.
That's the next episode.
Yeah,
fuck the text. Let's just talk about steampunk dragons.
I think I'll just publish like an inter episode about steampunk dragons.
You can still change your thesis, right?
No, I can't. But thank you very much, everyone, and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Goodbye.
Again, 3, 2, 1.
See you next time, everyone.